We are honored to have Dr. Gina Stewart as our very special guest on this African American Preaching Legacy Series. We are honored to have you. And so thank you so much for taking the time. I've been looking forward to this interview.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm certainly honored by the invitation. I've seen the caliber of preachers that you've interviewed, and so I'm glad to be on the list. I'm glad that you included me.
Well, first, thank you for being, a part of the PhD program. You are one of our brightest and best. We have such a wonderful cohort. You are part of that, and we're just excited that you've chosen CTS to come and be a PhD in homiletics.
Yes.
And what we're most excited about you is that you already are, a doctorate in the practice, but the theory and you're gonna be you can be dangerous.
Let's hope so.
More dangerous than you already are. You added danger to your danger.
I'm working hard.
Called danger.
I'm working hard.
To your danger. So, of course, a lot of people know who Gina Stewart is, but for the folk that do not know you, we have all kinds of international audiences that watch this. It's amazing. So, what would you like to tell someone that does not know you about yourself?
Well, I am the daughter of Annie, Jimmy, and Lepolia Stewart. I'm a native Memphian, and I pastor the church that I grew up in. I initially went to college to major in marketing, and while working for Control Data Corporation as a sales trainee and then moving to sales manager and later transitioning to work for Shelby State Community College as a director of admission, I was also called to the ministry. I did not expect that I would be pastoring, of course. I thought that because I was, for the most part, functioning as an itinerant bootlegging preacher for about 11 years before I accepted the call to ministry, that I would do that. I would work in higher ed and, just preach, do revivals, and make that a secondary type of vocation. But my pastor had a massive heart attack in a Bunton's restaurant in 1994. And to my surprise, even though I was raised and nurtured in a Baptist denomination that did not typically see women as being eligible or even called to preach or pastor, our church called me to pastor the church in March of 1995. I was elected in March of 95. So the last 23 years of my life have been spent leading the congregation of Christ Missionary Baptist Church. I really thought that my life would go in a different direction. I never would have anticipated that I'd be pastoring. I do remember saying that I wanted to work in ministry full time, but I had no idea that I would be pastoring. So, and I also have one sister and a brother and another sister, Lorraine, Dwight, and Maria, and I'm single with no dependents.
Wow, okay. All right. So I want you to back up a minute. Go all the way back to the call. Tell me about your call.
My call was rather interesting because as I said earlier, I actually started speaking in church when I was about 18 years old. We had a youth day celebration, and that particular Sunday I was given the assignment of extending the welcome and the occasion. And so I wrote a speech, and the speech turned into a little sermonette. So, you know how we do it, Baptist preachers. And so my pastor said, next year, you will be the youth day speaker, and Carla, his daughter, will be you will speak in the evening, Carla will speak in the morning. And so, you know, a year passed, and that's exactly what happened. From that, members of our church started talking to their friends, saying, there's this young girl that goes to our church, and she's not a preacher, but she speaks like a preacher. Mm-hmm. And so people started inviting me to speak at different churches. Wow. And from that, I started, you know, doing women days, youth days. I was, in those days, mistresses of ceremonies were really popular. Right, that's right. And so I spent a season also narrating for a community choir, the Angelic Voices of Faith. And actually, when I would narrate for them, I was doing many sermons too. Right. And my pastor would always say to me, you know, when are you coming to talk to me about preaching? Right. And of course, there were really no models in terms of women preachers, in terms of my experience and my upbringing. But thankfully, I had a pastor who believed that God could use women. Mm-hmm. And so he never had any issues or objections to even the thought of being called. In fact, he would bring it up more than I would. And he would always say, whenever you get ready, just let me know. Mm. And so finally, in 1989, I believe I really initially heard a call as we experienced it in 1986. Mm. I was leaving my parents' house, and I know that it was the voice of God. Mm. It was a heart impression, but it was a voice of God that was so strong that I began to cry. Mm. And I sensed God calling me into the ministry. But the fear of it, and as well as my desire and my fear of never getting married, because I was thinking, if I accept a call to ministry, I'll never get a husband. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, okay, we're going to negotiate this, right? Let's negotiate this, God. I'm going to do this, and I'll speak, but I won't accept the call to ministry. And so I pushed it out of my mind for about 3 years. But in the year of 1989, from January until December, there was this persistence that I could not shake. You know, I didn't see a light, I didn't see a burning bush, I didn't see myself standing before crowds speaking, but there was this nagging persistence that I could not shake. And so I committed it to prayer, and finally began to talk to my parents about it first, and then I talked to some of my friends, because you think about all of these things when you're really contemplating, at least I was, contemplating a call to preach. How will my friends act? You know, what will the members at the church say? How will I be received? What is this going to mean for my future as a female and all of this? Mm-hmm. And of course, the Lord won. Mm-hmm. And so the last Sunday in December of 1989, I went to service. I went to church before service started, and I told my pastor that I felt like I was being called to ministry. Mm-hmm. And he said, I was wondering what took you so long. And then he told me, he said, you'll never rest until you say yes. Yeah, wow. And so that was really the beginning of my journey officially with ministry. But 11 years prior to that, I had already been doing devotions, speaking in churches, narrating for concerts. Mm-hmm. So technically, I guess you could say I've really been preaching officially almost 30 years, but unofficially maybe more like 41. Wow. All my life, pretty much. Wow. Yeah.
Were there models that you could see?
You know, I've thought about that often, and honestly, my first preaching models were two women who really weren't preachers, officially. I think if they had come along in a different time, in a different season, they probably would have been preachers. They were definitely preachers, but they called themselves reachers. One of them was a lady by the name of Archie Mae Pratcher. She was a member of Middle Baptist Church, pastored by Dr. Benjamin Hooks. And the other was a lady named Nancy Givans. And one of the things that I gleaned from them primarily was not so much in terms of style or even structure, but just the confidence. I think that what they did for me as a young girl, because you know I was 18 years old, and most of the models in terms of preaching that I had heard, who came through our church, excuse me, for the most part had been male. But I think they helped me to sort of find my voice, if you will, as a female. And so while they were not necessarily trained as preachers, they didn't even acknowledge a call as preachers. If you heard them, you could hear there was a preacher in that bodysuit. And so I would say that they were really the first quote unquote models of women preachers that I saw. Now growing up, Deering King, who was also a relative of mine, my pastor used to invite him to come and preach at our church. So.
D.E. King.
D.E. King,
yeah,
right.
Saying,
I'm sorry.
No, you did fine.
Right.
It's part of your family.
That's
so,
right, because we're cousins, but D.E. King. And so he would do revivals for us. And of course, Reverend Clay Evans was related to my pastor, and he would always do revivals for us. But in terms of preaching models, my models and mentors for a long time in ministry were books. I met this guy named Danny Thomas in the early years when I was speaking and doing devotions and doing MC and all that. And he said to me one Sunday after I had done a devotion or MC the program, he said, "You need to be heard." He said, "God has gifted you and you need to be heard." And now Danny was a lay person actually, but he really loved God. He's still living. And he introduced me to Cokesbury Bookstore. It used to be over on Perkins Extended, and we went over there. And I've always been a voracious reader. And so I went in Cokesbury, and I just really fell in love with all these books. And to this day, I still love to read. Not just, religious books, but I like to read deep and wide. And so for a long time, my mentors were books. And then one year, my pastor invited Shirley Prince to preach at our church. And I was just struck by her preaching gift, her depth, her confidence, her boldness in proclamation. And we later became really good friends. And so she became like a friend and a mentor to me, not only in terms of her preaching, but also in terms of ministry. Particularly after my pastor died, I learned so much from her. So I would say she was probably one of the first, other than my pastor, and Archie Mae Pratcher, as well as Nancy Gavans, who sort of gave me an idea of how a woman ought to conduct herself in terms of public proclamation and public speech. And then, of course, Reverend Shirley Prince. And then after Shirley, through Shirley, I began to meet other people, because Shirley would always talk about, you need to meet Renita. She was talking about Renita Weems. And of course, I did not know her personally, but I became acquainted with her ministry through Shirley Prince. And then in later years, I actually became acquainted with Dr. Weems, and then I met other women. And so as time evolved, God began to allow my paths to cross with other women who helped to shape and form my preaching.
Okay. So how do you prepare a sermon?
I'm always asked this question. And so the irony of that question, the irony of the answer, I should say, is that while I am a very structured person in terms of the way I learn, you know this, I consider myself to be concrete sequential, and so I like everything step by step, but I'm very eclectic in terms of the way I prepare to preach. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm like that, I finally discovered a descriptor that explains my preaching preparation style. In the book, Preaching with Power, I think Dr. LaRue is the editor for that. Alice Bergie Bryant, Alice Bergie Bryant talks about the difference between a surfer and a sergeant. And she basically says that a sergeant is the type person who has a structured routine. The surfer moves according to a rhythmic and creative pattern. And that's really the way that I start to prepare my sermons. It's bathed really in prayer. And so in many instances, my sermons arise more out of life-led experiences than text-led experiences, although I can read a text and find inspiration for preaching. For the most part, though, I would say I'm a student of the word and scripture, of the word and culture. And so I think about ideas when I'm preaching. And because I have a deep commitment to social justice and prophetic ministry. I'm often thinking about what's going on culturally, and so oftentimes I'm thinking about that when I'm preparing the sermons to preach. And as a pastor, I'm always exegeting the congregation. I'm thinking about what is happening with those persons who sit in the pew, not just in terms of what's happening with them existentially, but I'm thinking about the different age groups that I'm talking to, with the intent of trying to reach them as well. So I would say it starts with meditation, and it's bathed in prayer, and then from meditation it goes to, observation and interpretation, because I read all kinds of periodicals. I'm always looking for ideas, because I think it's important to connect with the audience. And then once I land on an idea or a scripture that really grabs me, then I start with my interpretation, which is the exegesis, and then from interpretation is application, and from application, we pray to God for transformation. So I am what I would call a student of the new homiletic, though. When I enrolled in seminary, much of the preaching classes, or most of the books, I should say, that our preaching professors recommended to us were books by Eugene Lowry, Fred Craddock, and of course Henry Mitchell. And so, and I was already preaching that way anyway, but I learned some of the other skills in terms of narrative, the way narrative preaching works, inductive preaching, using RLEs or real life experiences to introduce sermonic thoughts and introduce sermons.
So do you prepare a manuscript?
Oh, yes. Yes, I always prepare a manuscript. I can preach without a manuscript, but I've just always written my sermons out. And even though I can be spontaneous, because I'm concrete sequential, and I don't want to miss anything and leave anything out, right, I have a tendency to rely on my manuscript, but I'm not tied to it. Most of the time, I try to prepare my sermons well enough in advance so that I've internalized it, so that if the iPad decides to go out or the computer decides to act crazy or whatever, I still have it in here. But I always write my sermons, write them out completely. I don't use outlines.
So you're preaching with a live manuscript, or with the manuscript. So how much of what you say on average is not on that manuscript?
Ooh, that's a difficult question to answer. I'm not sure. I would say probably 30 to 40%. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is probably one of the reasons why my sermons are a bit lengthy, because when I'm in that moment preaching, there's always some other idea that comes to me as I'm preaching, and so I may have the idea in the manuscript, but in that moment while I'm preaching, another idea might come to me spontaneously, and I'll insert that or inject that. So I would say probably 30 to 40% of it.
And I ask you that because, it's often presented as an either or. So
right.
Either you're tied to the manuscript, or you're flying free, you're composing freely. And I think there's a middle ground. And the middle ground is there's a manuscript, but you're not tied to it.
Right.
And, as you say, and what that means is there's a tremendous amount of freedom, and the manuscript provides the structure, so you don't get too far out
right.
there. But, you've already, concrete sequential, you've already laid the basic
right.
structure out.
And I believe, too, that a sermon is always in process. Yeah. I believe that we are constantly revising. I think that, even at its best, it's still a draft. Because I'm one of these, and I'm pretty sure that there are probably others that feel this way, too. After I preach a sermon, like, I should have said that. I thought about that. And sometimes it comes in the preaching moment. And then there are other times that I think about another thought or another insight that I could have inserted here or added here. And so the sermon is always up for revision.
Right. So if we were to ask you, given some of the traditional categories like expository or narrative or womanist, do you fit in any of those categories, hybrid, how would you?
I think that without a doubt, I'm narrative. Okay. But I also think that I preach in three voices. And I found this, I discovered this thanks to this program, because you're forcing us to really think about these things that we've been doing. But I appreciate it, because we do preach all the time, but we don't think about the theory behind what we do. And so while writing a paper for one of our classes, I believe homiletical theory, I was reading a book by Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert, The Journey to African American Preaching, and he lifted up this
Journey and Promise of African.
Journey and Promise of African. Let me get it right. Let me get it right. Journey and Promise.
I only did it because it means somebody wants to order
Right,
it.
they might want to order that book. Right, Journey and Promise of African American Preaching, and he lifted up this trivocal homiletic, and he talked about prophet, priest, and sage. And when I read that, I thought that in many ways, I feel that I preach in three voices. I preach, my one voice is pastoral, because that's primarily where I spend the majority of my time. And so I'm always thinking about congregational issues, issues of spiritual disciplines, transformation, stewardship, personal growth, and all those kinds of things that are related to transforming lives. And then, of course, there's this, as I mentioned earlier, this commitment to social justice in my preaching, or prophetic commitment in my preaching, which deals with the realities of finite disappointment. But in preaching, I'm always trying to construct this alternative future. And then, of course, because I'm female and because I have experienced so much as a woman in ministry, I believe that there's also a womanist lens that informs and shapes my preaching, which is committed to preaching liberation to all people, but certainly as the situation warrants, and as the text should warrant, or as the context should warrant, dealing with issues of racism and oppression and other issues that tend to create bias against certain populations. So I would say that I preach in three voices, I think. So I call it a trivocal womanist homiletic.
All right, now I know Kenyatta Gilbert is shouting right now.
Let's hope so, anyway. Let's hope so.
I'm going to send it to him to make sure he gets his
Right.
shout in.
Right. Right. It's a great book, though.
It is. It really is.
It's a really great book.
And he's great people. And,
Yes.
You know. So tell me about a time that was very difficult for you to preach. That could be a personal time, something in your personal life. It could be community, or it could be something in the church. I asked this question, give you the context of why I asked this question, is that, you know, people see preachers such as yourself as up here, you know, celebrate you, and don't know the story.
Right.
That, you know, every preacher has at some point, all that melts away, and you standing there, because standing there is the only thing you can do.
Right.
So give me a time that it was tremendously difficult, and you had to stand.
I can give you several, but
Well, I'll take them. I'll take them.
But the one that really, I think the one that was probably one of the most difficult was when I had to preach for Hampton. And I say that, and of course, you know, I'm always on edge when I preach,
right.
You know, because I know that preaching, Dr. Gardner Taylor said preaching is a matter of life and death. And so I know that, you know, when I'm standing behind a sacred desk, it's not just a moment for me to shine or to be seen, but people's souls are at stake. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always approaching the sacred desk with fear and trepidation. But Hampton, trepidation, but Hampton is a different animal because preaching to preachers is always challenging. Yeah. And, excuse me, you hear all these, you know, stories. You don't want to die before you preach at Hampton. And then, of course, when people find out you're preaching, they say, well, I don't know whether to congratulate you or to give you my condolences. And so, you know, it's very intimidating. It's very intimidating. You hear all the horror stories. You hear, you know, you don't want to die when you go to Hampton and all these kinds of things. And so I would say that preaching at Hampton was probably one of the most intimidating experiences, because when the word is out that you're preaching at Hampton, everywhere you go, you ready for Hampton? You ready for Hampton? And I'm saying to people, you know what, I have several other places that I have to preach before I get to Hampton, but I'm praying that I'll be ready. But I'll tell you what helped me the first time I preached. I was getting ready to go to the worship center, and I happened to listen to my voicemail, and Ralph West left a message on my voicemail. And he said to me, Gina, do what you do when you're at home. If you do what you do when you're at home, you'll be fine. Yeah. And I felt a peace after I received that message. And of course, the experience was not nearly as bad as I expected, or as difficult as I expected. The audience was warm and inviting, and especially in the morning, I felt that they really came for church. Right. So, but it was really probably one of the most difficult in anticipation of that moment. Right. Yeah.
So some of our viewers may not know what the Hampton Ministers Conference is, so would you just give a brief summary of what is the Hampton Ministers Conference?
Well, the Hampton Ministers Conference meets every year annually in June. It's a wonderful conference. It's a conference where you have I would say, some of the best and some of the brightest who come to preach. There's lectures, there's music, there's preaching, and of course there are classes. There's a woman in ministry session, but it is considered to be one of the premier stages. I guess you would say it still is, but at that particular time it was considered to be one of the premier stages for preaching or for preachers. And to receive an invitation to preach at Hampton was a signal honor, and I would say it probably still is a signal honor. And of course, being a female as well, because Hampton does have women who preach, but particularly it is a stage where you've in particular seen heard more male voices than female voices. Yes.
So you were blessed and privileged to do it twice.
Right.
Once you were the morning preacher.
Right.
And once you were the evening preacher.
Exactly.
So let's spend a minute on the night session preacher at Hampton.
Okay.
So set the stage for the night preacher at Hampton.
The first night that I preached at Hampton, I was afraid that the people would leave, because there was, I don't even remember who it was, but some speaker spoke before I did. And they were up, I know, probably 30 to 45 minutes before I came out. And so people would come back to the green room. And, you gonna be all right? I hope the folk don't leave before you get so you know, I'm a ball of nerves, right?
They helping you, right?
Right, they helping me. They encouraging me, scaring me and encouraging me at the same time. But really, one of the things, for me, the preaching experience really wasn't much different than the morning. I had heard real horror stories about the night spot, because that's the spot where they would say, well, you know, they walk out on you at night. And so I'm thinking, I'm having nightmares about people just walking out in droves, you know, when you're preaching. But it really was not much different than the morning for me. I felt that I didn't feel the tension. I didn't feel, and even though there's always, you know, some tension, I guess, in audiences where preachers are listening to preachers, I didn't feel that pressure that I thought I would feel when I got up to preach. And it was not a bad experience. Good. Yeah, and I'm grateful to Billy Curtis and Dr. Billy Curtis and Bishop Claude Alexander, who extended the invitation to preach both times. Billy extended the invitation when I preached in the morning, and Alexander in the evening.
Yes, you did a wonderful job. I was there for both. I was
there for both. We preached together the year. That's right. You were the morning preacher.
You were the night preacher.
Right.
I was there both times.
And you did a magnificent, outstanding job.
Well, thank you very much. I have my own Hampton story, so I won't go down that road because that is, you're the third person that's been in this chair in the last 2 days that has talked about Hampton.
Oh, wow.
And so we'll talk about that later. Woo, Hampton. But you were a blessing. You were a blessing.
Thank you.
You were a blessing.
Thank you.
Let's go to the other side. When was there a time that you thought God really used you? You know, usually we do the modesty thing as preachers. We know, but there is the side of us that I'm just thankful God really used me today. So when might the time that be?
There are a number of times in worship, and sometimes they're not always preaching moments. This past Sunday, I felt that God really used me, and actually I wasn't preaching. I had received a couple of inbox messages from members who were asking for prayer about specific situations. And so as I was pondering their request, because both of them attend our 10 o'clock service, and praying about it and thinking about where in our worship I would, call them up for prayer, I believe it was the Spirit that spoke to me and said, just call for prayer for people that might have special needs. And of course I did, and the rest is history. There was a great move of God in worship that day, this past Sunday, and there was really no preaching. It was just obedience to the Spirit of God. But what really blessed me that day, because sometimes when you do those things in worship, when people are used to a certain structure and a certain format, I know what I believe I hear God saying, but I also know what it may feel like and look like to people who came for worship with different expectations. And I had opened the doors of the church, extended the invitation to discipleship, and several people came up to unite with the church. I was about to lift the offering, and 3 of our young men who work in media were coming down the aisle. Millennials. Wow. And they were coming down, 2 millennials and 1 teenager was coming down the aisle. And so they came down and requested prayer. And but as they were about to take them to the back, I said, keep them out here. I want us to pray for them as a congregation. While we were praying for them, another young man came up. And as we were praying, I could just see him breaking under the power of God. And we just began to pray and minister to him. Well, a few minutes later, another man came up and began to cry and pray, and he was just hugging him. Well, as it turned out, it was his son. And he had been praying for his son to come back to the Lord. And it was just a great time of rejoicing. But I knew in that moment, when that happened, I knew in that moment that God had used me because I had been obedient to what the Lord had instructed me to do in that particular moment. The other moment that I believe that really comes to mind about when God used me was also at Hampton, and this was at night. And this was the second night after I preached. I preached that Luke 13 passage. And when I sat down, I was thinking to myself, I said, I don't know if I made any sense or not tonight. And I, looked up, and there's a section where some preachers sit in a section. And I looked up, and Dr. Jeremiah Wright was looking at me. And I could see nobody but him. And he was standing there with his finger, giving me the thumbs up. And I just grabbed my towel and started weeping.
Lost it, huh?
Right. Because, I can't even describe what that did for me in that moment. And of course, I think I must have sat there maybe 5 or 10 minutes just weeping. Just literally weeping, because to have a general like that, I'm about to weep now, a general like that to take a moment and just affirm what I had done, and to do that publicly just blessed me. And of course, behind that, there was like just an afterglow that swept through the center. And finally, I left. People started praising God. They started dancing and shouting and running around the worship center. And I finally left, and I got to my room. And about, I don't know, it must have been maybe after 11 o'clock that night, I called one of my church members, and I said, I was just checking to make sure that they made it back to the hotel, and they said, we're just getting back to the room. I said, from church? They said, Pastor, it was explosive. So I would say that night, it wasn't that I was looking for his affirmation, but it's like God used him to let me know that God was pleased. Yeah, I will never forget that.
So do you, I don't want to say prefer, there are some people who sit in this chair and say, do you prefer preaching on the road? Do you prefer preaching at home? And my question is a little deeper than that, but that's the best way I can articulate it. That, is there a difference between preaching at home and preaching on the road? Or tell me that.
I like both. I love pastoring. I love working with and ministering to people and seeing lives changed. I like that. But I also like preaching on the road as well. I like the exposure, having the opportunity to be exposed to other ministries. And preaching on the road for me is not just about the invitation, it's also been about the relationships that God has blessed me to nurture, and relationships that have developed. I have friends all over the country, really because of the invitations that I receive, and not just with the pastors, but with members of the congregation. And so that's really a gift and a blessing to me. I can't say that I prefer one over the other. I really like both. But one of the things that I think is different about preaching pastorally as opposed to preaching as an itinerant is that when I preach pastorally, I'm preaching for the most part for transformation. I'm preaching to help members grow. I'm preaching to deal with issues of personal transformation and life, universal human experiences. When I preach on the road, I typically preach for edification and exhortation because I'm not the pastor. I have the perspective of a pastor, and I think that probably comes through in my preaching, but I try to stay away from rebuking and correcting and all of that, and I try to lean toward exhortation and edification.
Do you have a favorite sermon?
Of my own? I guess I would say every year I have a favorite sermon, but not really. No, I wouldn't say I have a favorite. You know, as I'm preaching during the year, there may be a particular sermon that I feel really makes an impact. It's very impactful, but I wouldn't say I have a favorite sermon.
Do you have a favorite sermon by someone that you didn't preach, that it's not you, but another preacher that you might consider one of your favorite sermons?
I love listening to anything that Dr. Renita Weems preaches. But one of the sermons that really blessed me one year was a sermon that she preached at the Proctor Conference called Not Yet. I think that's the name of it. It was the Hebrews 11, Living with Unfulfilled Faith or something like that. I can't get the exact title of it right, but the scripture was about these all died in faith, but not having received the promise. And you know, I just felt like it was such a realistic sermon, because so often I've heard you say so often in sermons we can lean toward over promising and under delivering. But it dealt with the reality that sometimes what you preach, you may not see it in your lifetime. But you don't preach it because it happened to you or because of your experience. You preach it and you believe it because it's true.
Right. I think we published that sermon in the Preaching with Sacred Fire.
Right.
In the anthology. It's a powerful sermon.
Yeah.
Powerful sermon. Powerful sermon. Absolutely.
Yes.
So if you had to recommend some preaching books to our listening audience, now that you have this extensive repertoire.
Right. Thanks to the Reverend Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas.
That, so any stand out to you, any that really you think, somebody who's...
I would say anything, well, all of your books, your preaching books are great. And of course, one of them, one book that I would suggest should be a staple for any preacher is your book, They Like to Never Quit Praising God. Anyone who wants to know about structure and preaching, which I think is really critical in preaching, you know, structure is your friend, I think. And so I think that They Like to Never Quit Praising God is one that every preacher should have in their library. Also, The Certain Sound of the Trumpet by Dr. Sam Proctor is a great book. I've read just about all of Reverend Renita Weems' books. But one of her books in particular that blessed me in the early years of my preaching was Just a Sister Away, giving that womanist lens. And Dr. Elaine Flake has a great book out too, also called God in Her Midst, that deals with preaching healing to women and looks at preaching. Not only does she give some theory and talks about what womanist preaching is, but she also has sample sermons in that book that I believe are extremely helpful. And then, of course, you know, I mentioned Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert's book, The Journey and Promise of African American Preaching, is a really good book. And Dr. Kim Johnson has a good book too, called Proclaiming Rhetoric or Preaching Rhetoric, Proclaiming Rhetoric, Womanist Rhetoric from the Pulpit. I have to get the exact title of that, but it's a really good book too because it has theory, but she also uses sermons as examples.
That's a fabulous book.
It's a wonderful book.
We push it for her.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the close of the sermon, and you are very gifted in your close. So tell me about your thinking about your close.
Specifically, what do you mean?
You do it so well, it's not accidental. So which means you're intending something to happen. It's not disconnected from the sermon. It's a part of the process. So the close is not the main focus of the sermon per se, so that you sacrifice content up front to get there. Right. No, it's balanced. So all that says to me that you've been very intentional and done some thinking about the who, what, the why, and you do such a fabulous job. So I'm open to anything that you would tell us about.
I think that in general, when I'm closing a sermon, I'm always moving toward a motif of hope. You know, one of the things you talk about in your book, Celebration and Experience, I'm sorry, not Celebration and Experience of Preaching, but They Like to Never Quit Praising God. In your structure, one of the steps is celebration. And celebration is not always just a hoop, of course, and people standing on their feet, but that people leave with an assurance, as you say, of God's grace. And so in terms of intention, I'm always thinking about not only trying to paint an alternative picture, but also giving people what Dr. Paul Brown, one of my homiletics professors, used to say, is giving them some grace at the end of the sermon. Now, that doesn't always mean that people will leave shouting. It doesn't always mean that they will leave you know, standing on their feet. Particularly at home, they may leave being called to the altar. They may leave being called to reflect on some behavior or some pattern that needs to be changed. But I'm always trying to ensure that the close of the sermon is directly linked to the entire structure of the sermon so that it fits together as a compact and it's a whole. And so I'm always trying to begin with the end in mind. What is it that I really want people to leave here thinking or doing, or both, as a result of what they've heard? And so a lot of times the close, I may write the body of the sermon, but I may wait for a while before I do the close. And then I'll come back and finish that close, finalize the sermon.
One of the most beautiful thing about your closes is the emotive freedom or the emotive release that you know, it's this thing said, if you don't believe it,
right,
the people know. I mean, how can you ask people to believe what you don't believe? But there's something about after you've done all of this beautiful work that you do, and then, I call you a daughter of thunder. So we talked about this many times. You thunder, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. So how do you come to the level of emotive release and freedom within yourself? Go ahead.
I'm preaching to myself.
Trying to help yourself.
I'm preaching to myself. I'm getting happy. Really, I believe what I preach. Mm-hmm. I really believe it. And so even though I'm preaching, really, I'm serious. Look, I'm shouting while I'm writing it, I'm shouting while I preach it. But seriously, I really believe what I'm preaching. And I can sense, Reverend Joanne Browning always tells me, she says, I can always tell when you're ready, when you're about to shift gears and you're preaching, because your ears turn red.
I'll start watching for that.
She said, your ears turn red. But there is something going on inside of me as well when I'm preaching. And so it's not contrived. It's not something that I'm trying to work up an audience, so to speak. I am experiencing this as I am proclaiming it. And because, I've lived long enough to know that some of this stuff not some of this stuff, but I know this is true. Mm-hmm. I know that there are incidents in our lives that our experience doesn't always match what we preach. Mm-hmm. But I've lived long enough to bear witness and to have testimony that what I'm saying is the truth. Wow. And so, it just kind of happens. I can't explain. I don't have a formula. I don't have it just happens. It just, when I know anything, by the time I get to the close of the sermon, I've gone into another zone. Mm-hmm. But I've written it out first. Okay. But now, not all of it is written. Right. A lot of it is actually spontaneous. Right. Yeah. Right. It's the Lord. That's all I can say. It's the Lord.
Well, you do a wonderfully masterful job. And as women began to gain access, it was always the issue of, our trying to find models or are we imitating a man? Mm-hmm. You have a very it's natural to who you are. Yeah. It's natural to being a woman, and yet it thunders.
Yes. One of the things I always say to our preachers at our church is, do not ever allow anybody to even try to force you into trying to preach like me or anybody else. Be yourself, but be your best self. Yeah. And I think it's really important to find your voice and find your rhythm. And of course, I think that comes over time, and with experience and with opportunity.
Right. So, of course, one of the great questions is, why is it that Dr. Gina Stewart would go into a PhD in preaching program? She don't need it. So why do this PhD program in preaching?
Well, I believe that learning is a lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. I can't say that's original, but one of my members actually said that, Alicia Jones, and I affirm that learning is a lifelong journey, and I'm a lifelong learner. I like learning, and so when I heard about this program, I was already intrigued by the idea of getting a PhD in African American preaching. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to do it, because I had the same thought that some people ask me, why would you go and get another degree? You already have a D.Min and you've already been preaching all these years. But I thought about it, and as the opportunity presented itself, I was captured by the idea of getting the theory to go with the practice. Yeah. I know the practice of preaching, but I didn't have the theory. And so I thought that having both would just be a wonderful combination and a beautiful marriage. And of course, it's turning out to be just that, having been in this program. And it's also equipping me to answer questions to preachers that are asking me these questions. Because it seems that now that I'm in this program, some of the same questions that we're answering in class are questions that I'm answering in class. But now when people ask me, I have the theoretical answer as well as the practical answer.
Tell the audience about the Philadelphia phone call. You called me from Philadelphia. Remember that? It was a Saturday morning, and it was, I can see you don't quite remember it.
Oh, I was excited.
Right, yeah,
oh,
right,
yeah.
right. So tell me,
well,
right.
Because, we had been doing all this work. You had us working like Hebrew slaves. And so I was talking about you real bad behind your back about doing this paper on theory. You had us working on our preaching method. That's what it was. And I had just finished my paper. I went to preach for this preaching association in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was an association that was comprised primarily of men and women who pastored churches and people who were ministers at churches. The young woman who was my host asked me if I would be willing the next day, because my flight was leaving later that afternoon. She said, would you be willing to meet with a group of women preachers? I said, sure. I'm thinking we're going to lunch and all of this. I get there, it's a preaching workshop. And the first question they asked me was, tell us your preaching methodology. I wanted to shout. Because I had worked on it on the paper. Right. And it was like, okay, God, all of this stuff is really coming together. It's really beginning. And when I tell you, over the last year, I have had several experiences like that. So it just really affirms the work that you're doing. It affirms what this program means for those of us who are looking to, not only preach well, but also have a theory to back up that preaching. It's much needed because people are asking these questions. People want to know, how do you prepare your sermons? What's your preaching methodology? They want to know that. They know what they see, but it's like getting under the hood of a car. Exactly. They know what the car looks like, but they want to get behind the sermon. And it's a great joy to be able to explain that in ways and in terminology that people can understand.
Tell me about your dissertation topic.
Well, I'm doing my dissertation on Dr. Claudette Anderson Copeland, and I tentatively have as a dissertation topic and focus a womanist homiletic of healing. The preaching of Dr. Claudette Anderson Copeland, a womanist homiletic of healing. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I know all this.
Right.
I'm really doing for the Memphis audience. Right.
You really got to shout. I see.
I felt that.
Way down. Shundo. Okay.
Because she really does have a healing homiletic.
She does.
Right.
She does.
You've named it.
Yeah, it's a dominant thread. Spiritual, primarily in terms of what I hear, spiritual and emotional. She has that. She has that surgeon persona and healing persona.
So just in case there are people in the audience who have never heard of Preacher Dawn, so just say a little bit about her so that they'll look her up on YouTube from this, but they should know.
Dr. Copeland?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Claudette Anderson Copeland served for, I guess, maybe 30 years as the co-pastor at New Creation Christian Fellowship Church with her husband, Bishop David Michael Copeland. It was a ministry they founded. But she is also a preaching phenom, as they say, whose preaching ministry spans more than 40 years. And one of the things that I really like about Dr. Copeland is not just her preaching gift, but her breadth and her depth. We have this joke whenever she gets up to preach. We said, that thing is deep. Because she always takes you to that deep place, but she's also very, she really gets down beneath the surface. She doesn't deal with shallow issues, shallow and superficial issues in her preaching. She really deals with deep issues. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I'm, considering as a topic the healing homiletic in her preaching, because I see that whenever she preaches, there's always some invitation to healing, whether it's emotional or mental or psychological or even spiritual or maybe even physical, but there's always that motif in her preaching.
Well, thank you so very much. This has been just an awesome interview. I am excited that, of course, you're in the program and doing so very well, and I do very much, of course, this is the affirmation of theory and practice that, that moves together in you, and what I hope moves together in just so many preachers. And we don't think about the theory. We do it. But if somebody asks us, how do you do that? And the asking and the answering of that has to do with replication.
Right.
So that others can get better. So that others can step their preaching up.
Right.
And so I'm excited that, you know, you could sit at the plateau of where you are and crest on into the sunset, but to make sure that there are people behind you, both women and men, who get better and better, because we really, I mean, you know, the reign of God comes in the togetherness.
Right.
No one church can bring it forth. It's got to be a bunch of churches. And so I want to thank you for the extra work that you're putting in, and I can't wait to read more and more about the healing homiletic.
Yeah, and I was also thinking too that this program, I think, is going to probably lead to more writing.
Oh, tell me about
African American scholarship in terms of writing, because when I think about the new homiletic, for example, you know, most of the books that I read were by Eugene Lowry, Fred Craddock, and of course Henry Mitchell. But I think that this program is going to give birth to, and of course there are others. You know, I mentioned Kenyatta Gilbert, Lisa Thompson, and others. But I think that this program is also going to birth more writers and more African American scholarship in theory. Because what we find a lot of books that have sermons in them, but the theory, I think, is going to, we're going to really see more of that as more people graduate, more students graduate from this program. So, any final word you'd like to say? You've got tremendous experience, pastoral experience, preaching experience, scholarship experience, all this. Any final word? I've asked you a lot of questions, but any word that you want that's on your heart that I either haven't asked you about, or anything's on your heart you would like to say? I guess the final thing that I would say, there's so many things I could say, but one of the things that I really want to be a matter of public record is my appreciation for what you have done with this program, for the excitement that it's generating, for what it's doing for myself as well as my cohort, our cohort, not just in terms of what we're learning as preaching, but the community that we formed as a cohort, and what this program is really going to mean to the church and to the world. I just think it's going to be a blessing. You said you believe that African American preaching can bring about a renaissance. I believe you're right. And I believe that the times in which we live definitely call for it. So what we say, is just for everybody, what we say is that African American preaching can generate a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity in the 21st century. So thank you for that. I believe it in my heart, and I know you do too. And you've been a real blessing, and we can't wait to hear more of your preaching. And may I add, the books you're going to write. Hallelujah. Speaking prophetically over you. Come on, prophet. Break some oil out, right? But I mean it, you're going to write some stuff. I hope so. You will, you will. I hope so. So maybe a professor of preaching somewhere someday. Oh, come on, prophesy. Well, you know, I already do an intensive. Yes, yes. I'm talking about your teaching ministry, so go ahead. Yeah, I already do an intensive every year at Virginia Union. I'm grateful to Dr. John Kinney, who extended the invitation to be a part of the adjunct faculty at Virginia Union. And what I'm teaching is really like a practical theology class, but of course, we never get out of the class without some preaching taking place. But it's really been great to have a chance to interact with the student body, and to be on an HBCU campus is really, really special too. So I do enjoy that. It's been great. I've also taught adjunct a couple of semesters, 2 or 3 semesters at Memphis Theological Seminary as well. So I'm hoping that this degree will just... You got some more of it coming. You got a lot of it coming. Right. All right, so thanks, sis. I appreciate you so much. Thank you. God bless you. I appreciate you. Bless you.